Hello everybody and welcome to session 4 of the conference. So our first speaker in this session is Kate Lyons from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she will talk to us about evaluations of South Delhi's linguistic landscape online survey.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. So yes, my name is Kate Lyons, and I'd first like to thank all of you for coming out to hear me speak today, and really appreciate it. So what I'm going to be talking about today is valuations of South Delhi's linguistic landscape, this online survey component. So the online survey component is part of a larger sort of study I was doing on South Delhi's linguistic landscape. So in this presentation, I'll kind of give a brief rundown of what I did for that larger study, and then kind of talk about the survey's role in that larger study and what I was trying to accomplish with it. So to begin, I think an important question is, what is a linguistic landscape? What are we talking about here? So basically, it's written language displayed in public space. And this is this other definition provided by Landry and Voorhees is a very, it's cited a lot in linguistic landscape studies. So they kind of talk about, public road signs, advertising, billboards, and, any kind of displayed language. That all comes together to make up a linguistic landscape. And we usually talk about it in terms of a given territory or region, so a city, neighborhood, etc. So I think something that's important to talk about when we're sort of talking about what linguistic landscapes are and why it's important to study them, we talk a lot about how language is spoken and heard, but not so much about how it's displayed and represented. And that's what linguistic landscape studies are trying to do, is sort of delve into that. So there's this understanding that displayed language is agentive, so there's someone who is putting that language out there. It's a very agentive act, and there's people who are interacting with it. So we can kind of think about it as it's an interaction. It's a context of interaction. Yeah. So when we're talking about linguistic landscapes, we want to see how we can contextualize this interaction that's going on between the displayed sign and the viewer who's seeing it. And we can talk about it in terms as sort of that we can see the linguistic landscape as sort of indicative of a certain linguistic community, and that the linguistic landscape itself also is sort of influencing that community as well. So how do we start to unpack this? This is where this particular theoretical framework of using Goffman's frames comes into account. So Nicholas Coupland, in his 2012 paper on the linguistic landscape of Wales, he's talking about bilingualism on display in Wales. He uses Goffman's concept of frames to kind of unpack what's going on in the linguistic landscape. So what a frame is, it's sort of this way of, a way to conceptualize how humans understand and sort of break down context. So it's sort of, I think he uses the phrase, it's how humans figure out what's going on. That's the answer to that question. So I think a good example of how to explain what a frame is, for example, if you're sitting in a theater and you're watching a play and you see somebody get shot on stage, you're not going to be too, maybe you're attached to the character or something, you might be upset in that way, but it's not going to be really, it's okay. I know from previous contexts and my history that this is a play, it's not real, but if I saw the same thing on the street, that's a different frame, so I might have a totally different reaction. Hopefully you'd have a different reaction. So what we're doing here is we're taking this idea of frames, how we contextualize experience, and kind of applying it to the linguistic landscape context where it's an interaction between, the sign displayer and the viewer, and they're sort of both coming into this context and interacting. So what I did for my study in the linguistic landscape survey, I took around, let's see, there was probably around 2,500 signs that I cataloged all around South Delhi, and then I kind of was looking at it and I found 4 patterns, and I sort of described them using frames. So we're talking about it in terms of sort of an interaction, right? Describing that interaction. Yes. So this is part of the larger study. I was kind of going into a macroscopic analysis and also a microscopic analysis. That's what I was doing for the larger linguistic landscape study. But what I'll be talking about today is the online survey portion. And what I'm trying to do with the survey, so we're talking about these frames and using frames to describe the linguistic landscape. What I was trying to do with the survey is see, okay, does this really work? Do people who live in South Delhi or Delhi, are they agreeing with this? Is it doing a good job in capturing their perceptions of the linguistic landscape? So these are some of the questions I was asking, right? So want to see how they react to the characterizations that I've made as the researcher in describing South Delhi's linguistic landscape. And I was also curious to see if there was any sort of, if I had a certain sign or that was in a certain frame, did they associate that sign with a particular neighborhood? And when I was using the neighborhoods as sort of representative of certain socioeconomic levels, right? And I'll show you some graphs later of the different neighborhoods and what I was looking at. And also just to, kind of see again, is this frame theoretic analysis of South Delhi's linguistic landscape. Is it working? Am I on the right track? Okay, so surveys have been used in linguistic landscape studies before, not as much. There's this, again, Landry and Borges study in 1997. They were looking at Francophone students, high school students in French-speaking areas of Canada, and they did find that there's this sort of carryover effect of the linguistic landscape on language behavior. So sort of going back to the idea, it's very reflexive, right? So you have the linguistic landscape being indicative of the linguistic community and vice versa, kind of going back and forth. So this is the area I was looking at, South Delhi, India. It's the southern part of the city, hence the name South Delhi. This area kind of began to expand a lot after partition in 1947 and independence. You had lots of refugees coming in from both East and West Pakistan, and it just kind of started growing throughout the 60s and 70s. And then after liberalization in the early 1990s, you get another explosion. And so now it's sort of becoming you know, lots of people are coming in. It's becoming more posh, kind of a wealthier place to live, very chic. And these are the neighborhoods I was looking at. I chose 6 neighborhoods, and you can see, I mean, not really defense colonies up in the north, and you have Munirka over there. I guess that's in the west. But this is why I chose these neighborhoods, because I felt like they showed you, they were pretty representative. These are the average housing prices in Indian rupees. You can see that, you know, it's sort of a good collection of different neighborhoods in terms of how much the housing prices are. So I was kind of looking at in terms of, okay, well, are the signs, you know, the frame distribution and the language distribution, what can we see when we're comparing it against all these different neighborhoods? So that's why I chose these 6 neighborhoods. All right, and these are some of the languages these are some of the languages I was looking at. There's 8 of them. I'm not going to go into them too much, but if you have questions, feel free to, you know, come up to me and talk about it. All right, so moving on to frames. So this is what I was testing with my survey, right? So when looking at all these different signs, the frames, I chose them. So 2 of these come from previous work on linguistic landscapes. Conventional semiotics and transgressive discourses come from Skolin and Skolin's work that they've done on linguistic landscapes. And then EndoChic Nostalgia and global cosmopolitanism I sort of got from, you know, discussions of recent patterns in, you know, upper middle class Indian society, work done in sociology, anthropology, etc. All right, so here's some examples of the frames. So this is the first one, conventional semiotics, and we can kind of think about this one as the unmarked frame. So it's sort of, you see, it's very common, nothing too special, it's repeated over and over again. We have these 3 signs here. Oh, I have a pointer. I should probably be using this. There we go. Okay, so we have these 3 signs here. So this one says button, he button. This one is CNG, he CNG, and parate, he parate. So this X, he X construction is sort of used to say a lot of whatever you're saying. So this, for example, is so many buttons, right? There's a lot of buttons at the store. And the same thing here. So CNG, compressed natural gas, this is used by a lot of taxi drivers and auto rickshaw drivers. And the same here. So parathas are the stuffed bread. They're very tasty. So they're just saying, we have lots of parathas here. But you see this all over the place. It's very conventionalized. Okay, this is a way of selling a product or advertising it. And then the same thing for here, this one here, government wine shop. And it says Tundi beer, which just means cold beer. And this is a very conventional way of showing for this kind of sign for the government wine shop. Just the yellow background, black paint. You see it all over the place. It's not really particular. And the reason why we're calling this unmarked, so it's through these conventional semiotics that other frames sort of assert themselves and are made salient and kind of more, they stand out. So sort of the next frame, EndoChic Nostalgia. I got this term from Sadia Tour's work. She talks a lot about this idea of EndoChic Nostalgia, and she also calls it New Orientalism. So it's this discussion of, you know, after economic liberalization in the early 90s, you have all these wealthy sort of upper middle class individuals who have a lot of nostalgia for an authentic Indian identity or an authentic Indian past, right? So what happens is that there's this sort of exotification and commodification of products from the past, but it's sort of by Indians, you know, it's Indian products that are being exotified by Indians, hence the term New Orientalism. So in this case, we see this is another restaurant, and the name Roll Mall, and then underneath it says Roll Ka Under Kya Hai, which just means what's underneath the roll. And you can see that this is written in Roman script, but it's sort of been made to look like Devanagari. They have a little line over it. At the top here, and in the display there's all these antique rolling pins. So these are very old-fashioned rolling pins. You'd see them in your aunt's kitchen. So they kind of evoke the sense of nostalgia. So it's kind of banking on that. But at the same time, this is a very upscale restaurant, right? It would be very expensive to eat here, and especially this idea of the food of the roll. It's just usually bread with some meat or other things put in it. It's kind of a street food that you would usually get. So the fact that it's being turned into this upscale restaurant, right, this is indicative of EndoChic nostalgia. And on the other side of this is global cosmopolitanism. So sort of this reference to things that are distinctly non-local to sort of portray this very chic cosmopolitan identity. So I think this is my favorite example. You have this spa called Tranquilize Now, making reference to the film Apocalypse Now. It's in the same font. They're kind of playing with the words, right? So it's this active reference to something that is distinctly non-local, kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like, oh, see, we're very much involved in these, this global cosmopolitan atmosphere. And the same thing here with organic foods and natural foods. And the next frame, transgressive discourses. So these are things that either intentionally or unintentionally sort of violate the conventional semiotics in a different way. So I think we'll just talk about this example here. This was found in Malviya Nagar, which is more dominated by Hindi and English signs. And you have this sign, Kerala Store, Kerala Tailor, and then up on the top you have a couple phrases written in Malayalam. So it's sort of like, hey, we're sort of showcasing the a marker of authenticity, and also sort of transgressing the conventional semiotics to sort of show that, okay, we're sort of showing our authenticity as we're coming from Kerala. And the same thing here with the sign in Bengali. It's sort of showing, and this is in the Bengali neighborhood in CR Park, but at the same time sort of embracing the Bengali identity and sort of showing, a frame that is sort of transgressing the conventional semiotics to invite people who would, understand that, be able to step into that same frame. And then finally, this was one that I wasn't really expecting to find, but you do find this idea of melding frames where you have both global cosmopolitanism and EndoChic nostalgia, so international by art, Indian at heart. So you see these things coming together. So I wanted to test this online because I'm making these sort of diagnosing these frames for this particular space, and I wanted to see, well, okay, do delegates agree, and to what extent? And so what I did, I had an online survey. It was distributed on Survey Gizmo. It was around 10 to 15 minutes long, and for each frame I had 2 photos, and I included the melded frames in this as well to see what people thought of those. So for each frame I had around 4 statements, and I tried to keep them as similar as possible, and then they had a little Likert scale, and they could agree or disagree with the statement. So usually about 1 statement about the language on the sign, about the business, or 2 statements about the people who would go to the business. And then after that, I would have a question that was coded separately about if they saw a particular sign, and I said, okay, where do you think the sign would be? And there were these 3 neighborhoods. And the reason I picked these 3 neighborhoods was they are pretty, different. So people are making, they have a nice range of choices about, okay, if I see this sign, am I going to associate it with a more wealthier neighborhood, a less affluent neighborhood? And then finally a background questionnaire at the end where I ask these questions: where they grew up, lived in Delhi, how long they lived in Delhi. So one of the requirements for taking the survey, I wanted people who had lived in Delhi for at least 5 years. Luckily, I got a lot of people who grew up there or live there currently, so that was good. So these were the participants. I had I had 13 participants, mostly middle and upper middle class. And I think, it's an online survey. It was distributed mostly through Facebook and email. So, and these are people who have computer access. The average age was around 31, but it was a good range, around 26 to 55. Most of them were well educated, the Indian equivalent of a bachelor's or higher, and pretty, equal, 7 males and 6 females. So this is what I did to code it. So I have all these, like a picture of the frame. I'll just do this example actually. So I had one of these pictures, right? So for example, this would be displayed, and then I would have a statement: Hindi is used in the sign to show that the product at the store is authentic, right? And then they would say, okay, agree or disagree. So what I wanted to do was also test to see if they were agreeing with these statements and as far as what the frames are, but I was also curious in that they would agree of what the frames are not. So I would show the same statement with a different picture. So this is a different frame, right? This is a conventional semiotics frame. And for this, I would think, according to me, this would be strongly disagree, right? So the way I coded it was I went through and I took the survey myself, and I used that as the final number. I sort of counted up all the, my scores on the Likert scale. And then everyone who took the survey, for example, if they strongly agreed with me here, okay, we're on the same page, 5. If they strongly disagreed, they also got a 5. But if it went the other way, so if they agreed with the conventional semiotic sign in this statement, then they would get a lower score. So what I did after adding up all the individual scores for each frame, it was sort of an agreement score, because that's what I was looking at. I really wanted to see how much they were agreeing with me in terms of these characterizations that I was making. And just sort of curious, okay, well, did they agree with one frame more than another? Are there certain frames associated with neighborhoods? So this is what I got. These are the average agreement scores by frame. So you can see that they agreed. So the percentage, these are actually percentages. So the way I calculated this was, how many out of my final score, what their score was divided by my final score to get these agreement percentages. So for the most part, they agreed the most with conventional semiotics, followed by transgressive discourses, then global cosmopolitanism, and EndoChic Nostalgia, and melded frames. So, pretty good agreement. Mean agreement score was around 80%. And so I was kind of curious in looking at the difference, what sort of things we could see, any sort of information from the survey that the background. The only thing that was really different from most of the people who had responded was, I think around, half of them were from, not from South Delhi, and half were from South Delhi. So I was curious to see, okay, well, did they, respond to it differently? And I did a t-test, and there was a significant difference in their agreement scores. So then when I used a mixed ANOVA and was kind of looking at, okay, I want to compare what their ratings were, what their agreement scores were, and I did find that there was a main effective frame type on agreeability scores, and that the subject group did really make a difference. So North Delhi and South Delhi, not North Delhi specifically, but people who are not from South Delhi are having quite different agreement scores than those who are not from South Delhi. So you can see it better on this interaction plot. So you have these guys are from not from South Delhi, and these guys are from South Delhi. So you can see that South Delhi, they consistently score higher in terms of, their agreement scores, in terms of what I had put forth as the frames, right, in describing these interactional contexts. And it was sort of conventional semiotics was the highest, and then you have transgressive discourses here, global cosmopolitanism, EndoChic Nostalgia, and melded frames. All right, and then going back to the other thing I was testing, which was which neighborhood would they place each. So if they were given a certain frame or a certain sign, where would they put it? Would they put it in the really wealthy neighborhood, middle, or the less affluent neighborhood? So I did a chi-square test, and I did find that there's a significant association between the type of neighborhood and frame assignment. And signs in certain frames such as EndoChic Nostalgia or global cosmopolitanism, they were much more strongly associated with wealthier neighborhoods, whereas conventional semiotics, they were placed in Govindpuri, which is the least affluent neighborhood. So in conclusion, while limited in subjects, I was kind of looking at the survey as sort of a way to, because I think the frame theoretic analysis is sort of in its first stages. It's just, that paper just came out last year. People are sort of experimenting with it. And so I just wanted to see kind of for how far we can take it a little bit further. So it does show promise in that there are agreement with the assessments made with using the frame analysis, and that it sort of also was interesting to see that people from South Delhi had a stronger agreement with it. So I think that also provides support for this theoretical claim that linguistic landscapes are really these unique microenvironments where there's these specific spatial and cultural dynamics that are happening, and to kind of that we should take that into consideration when doing linguistic landscape research. All right, well, thank you.
So we have something like 12 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. This is interesting, and I am interested in second language teaching and acquisition. And I wonder how can we just link this to language teaching and second language acquisition. If you have any thought about this and made any link to curriculum design, material development.
Oh, in terms of what they would see, if you're in an area and looking at the linguistic landscape. And
yes.
I think it would be interesting, definitely, to make it more applied in the sense that you can use these examples in doing second language, instruction. But I think there has been, you might want to talk to Iftikhar. Is he here? I think he's there. Yes, Iftikhar, about this, because I think there was a recent presentation at, what was it, TESOL, that they were talking about using linguistic landscape data and sort of mapping it onto, I don't know, creating curriculums for second language teaching.
That was basically plenary talk at the TSWOT this year. There was a professor from the University of Birmingham, so it was very interesting. He did a video and then pictures at the Indian school.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We all enjoyed that. But there is one question I've been thinking about, and that is, could you use like open-ended questions to see what they really feel before you sort of give them like an idea what you're looking for? I don't know. Maybe you could get some more stuff, you know, to see what would first come to their mind when they see these signs.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I did have the open comment boxes, and it was really interesting because I think that's why I would like to do this on a larger scale and maybe do it in person as well. Because we had some of the responses. So, for example, for the EndoChic Nostalgia, they had disagreed with the statements, but then they said, oh no, hipster daisies would go here. And that's exactly what I was looking for. I just hadn't phrased it the correct way. So I think in that sense, that's a really good point, and I did get some of that feedback from this survey. So yeah, I'm definitely going to take that into consideration. But yeah, exactly.
I was wondering how the different signs are viewed by people who are from different neighborhoods. So did you get data, background data on the people from what neighborhood they're from? And have you had a chance to look to see were certain types of signs seen favorably by people from one neighborhood compared to people from another neighborhood?
Right. I think, well, because I had to sort of group it in terms of South Delhi because there were so few participants. But yeah, I think that would be something that would be interesting to see because there were some variation about, I think, socioeconomic status as well. For people who were living in wealthier neighborhoods, it seemed that, I don't know, some things they were a little less, they actually had a little more, what was it? They were a little bit more reluctant to talk about the EndoChic Nostalgia one. There wasn't as much agreement on that front. But I think that would be something that would be interesting to look at more too, because I think there might be some relationship there. Just need more participants.
It seems like it tells us a little bit more about why those signs are put.
Yeah, no, exactly, that they're very much related to the audience. Yeah, reflexive, exactly.
Just going off of that, I wonder too if when you talk about that people in South Delhi categorize it slightly differently than people in the northern part of Delhi. So just going along with this whole idea of using frame analysis for linguistic landscape, do you feel like it gives some more insight into the theory in the sense that frames are not just determined by what is put on the sign, but by who is viewing it, so that different groups of people could be actually operating with different frames?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I know, exactly, because it is, like we were discussing, yeah, exactly. That's a good, yes.
Interesting talk. I'm a bit concerned about comparing South Delhi with the rest of Delhi, because the rest of Delhi is multifarious.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
So the question is, was the rest of Delhi, was that population that you interviewed from a particular area, or was it just scattered all over? If it's scattered all over with a few people that you interviewed, it's very hard to get any, clear reading on those.
Yeah, actually, most of the people who were not from South Delhi are mostly from like the NCR area, so mostly Noida and Gurgaon. Yeah, so maybe that I should take that into consideration too, instead of just saying rest of Delhi. Like, okay, no, they're actually in more of the suburb part. But I think it would be interesting too to maybe look at specific areas, compare specifically North Delhi, like that Delhi 6 neighborhood.
The other thing is that you can also get crossover from one to the other, right? I mean, I can imagine, and I'm sure I've seen signs of that sort, which are what you would call conventional. But the fact that they are conventional in a chic neighborhood basically gives you a different reading. And you might want to check for things of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I was focusing most on South Delhi. So the things I were counting as conventional semiotics, the neighborhoods I was looking at were a little different, but there were still enough of that consistent looking, conventional signs that was like, okay, well, this would be conventional. But it does, I guess you do have to take that into consideration as well when you're, say, in defense colony and these things are conventional for that particularized space. But I think it works for just looking at South Delhi to kind of make these claims about what frames are being presented in what areas.
So you wouldn't have seen anything which would be conventional from one perspective, but because it is in a chic neighborhood, gives you the nostalgic effect.
Wait, say that one more time.
Something which, from a general perspective, might be called conventional, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because it's in a chic neighborhood, it really has this kind of nostalgic effect.
Right. But I think I did see things that, were sort of were references to that nostalgia. It was sort of distributed among the different neighborhoods, not as much, but I think, yeah, that's true, that what is conventional. And I think that's something I wanted to talk, just about the overall survey itself. I'm focusing, the frames that I was choosing, that doesn't mean that they're the only frames that are operating in that context. I think if you were to, I was coming at it more from a perspective, okay, like middle class, upper middle class, these are sorts of the things I'm looking at, but I think you could delve into anything and kind of find more variation in terms of what is conventional, what isn't. But I think for the purposes of this, what I was looking for, it was like, okay, this will work as to describe it in this way. But yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you. I was wondering also, you had people that they were between 20 something and then 55. I was wondering if you found any differences in generational ages or something like that, even if you had one or two speakers of that age group, and whether you're considering that as a factor to see where the nostalgic or when the cosmopolitan frame is popping up, at what time of the Indian history or the New Delhi history is coming up.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, because it was just 55. I think somebody was like, oh, I'll have my mom take it, which was good. We need that. But what I think, yeah, she was different. So it was the EndoChic Nostalgia wasn't as, but unfortunately it was just that one person. So it was a little bit hard. But I think that is something, again, to look forward to if you expand the study. I think that would definitely be something that would be interesting to look at in terms of generational effect of how they're interacting with these public displays.
I was just wondering if you had done any research in the business side and with advertising, because I think it's really neat how you're presenting this and looking at it linguistically, but I didn't know if it would be helpful for you or if you have done any research into some theories in advertising, and I don't know what's in there, but if that could help you in your research, or if you have already, or if you had thoughts about that.
Yeah. Actually, for the global cosmopolitanism frame, I did look at some of the research on that in terms of, they talk about this idea of a quality halo. So it's sort of, they did research in quote unquote developing countries, but I feel like this is sort of a phenomenon that happens everywhere, is that if something is coming that is not local, there's sort of a more prestige associated with it. So far, I did kind of look around to see if there was any stuff on nostalgia, particularly in India, but there wasn't that much stuff in terms of, advertising or methods of advertising something. But yeah, I think hopefully, I don't know, I'll keep looking.
Last question.
Oh. I had a question about the visual data. Like, how much is the visual affecting what you're looking at linguistically? Because there's so much going on with colors and fonts. Even when you present the picture, like if you're showing the building itself and not cropping into the sign, like, is that affecting the perception? Like, can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, because when I was assigning the frames, I took, mostly it was the content and the language was the first thing I considered, and then sort of also, those other aesthetic factors, was it painted on a wall, or was there some kind of professional, production involved in it? But yeah, I think, because that's what the signs that I did crop or didn't crop, it was just sort of, they were all sort of similar in how much of the surrounding environment was being shown. So, that's something to consider, but I don't know if it would have been that much of an influence. But, it's something to think about for sure.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. It was very interesting. And actually, I come from advertising, and I work in advertising, and I can confirm everything you've said. So, so from a business side, it is true entirely. So advertisements are not made in a halo. We don't work them out in a room separated from everybody else. First of all, we study the market, and we study the micro communities that you were talking about. So the fact that these ads are written in certain ways is a reflection of research that was done in advertising that showed that there are these certain populations. So that was just my bit. Congratulations, great.
Thank you, Kate. So